Thank you, Mr. Wong. We will now commence with our keynote presentation by Chief Sustainability Officer, Director for Air Transport at the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, also known as CAAS, Mr. Daniel Ng. Mr. Ng will be presenting on developing a sustainable Singapore air hub. In 2022, Mr. Ng was concurrently appointed as the Chief Sustainability Officer to develop, implement, and review domestic and international climate change targets, policies, and strategies across CAAS and the Singapore aviation ecosystem. Let us welcome Mr. Ng.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the invitation, I think, from the organizers to us to share some of our perspectives. I think Eugene just mentioned, I think, the importance of air connectivity, both especially for an island country like Singapore. And this is also why in Singapore or in CS, we have always seen the role of sustainability and how we develop Singapore as a sustainable air hub is actually very critical strategy for us in the next 10, 20, maybe even up to 2050. Our basic premise is that aviation must continue to grow. It must, however, grow in a more sustainable manner. It is not about reducing demand, which I think some segments of society, maybe not in Singapore yet, but in certain parts of the world have been talking about converting to rail or not traveling. I think for a small, connected, open economy like Singapore, that actually is not a good or even viable alternative. So the challenge for us is really how do we make aviation more sustainable? I think Eugene mentioned we're about 2% of emissions. The challenge, of course, is that aviation is and many of you are well aware, aviation is a very hard to abate sector. I mean, the technology, the physics just makes it very challenging for us to reduce emissions. If we don't do so and we continue on a business as usual kind of development while the rest of transport, like road transport, converts to electric or hydrogen fuel cells, then we'll be left actually being the largest contributor to emissions. And that actually is not a viable option for us either. So in terms of the broad sharing today, like I mentioned, we look at both international as well as domestic emissions. So international emissions will be all the flying activities that happens by our Singapore carriers, Jetstar Asia, Scoot, Singapore Airlines. We also look at domestic, which will be all the emissions generated at the airport. So as a nation, I think we have seen a very strong push. Singapore is committed to global climate change action. Our emissions is about 0.1, and this is domestic emissions, 0.1% of global emissions. We are actually set a goal to peak by around 2030 and to go down to net zero by around the mid-century. So these are the national ambitions. Of course, some of you may be aware that in Singapore, we are what we call an alternative energy disadvantaged country. There's not a lot of space for solar panels, and even if solar panels are deployed, I mean, if you look at the weather this morning, it's fairly cloudy, so the efficiency and the yield of solar panels are actually quite poor, which is why I think we have been looking from our colleagues at EMA very eagerly into importing low carbon energy from elsewhere, because that is actually the main opportunity for us to decarbonize our grid. So that's the domestic. If we look at aviation sector, we have actually set a goal to develop Singapore as a sustainable air hub. So the key thing is it's sustainable, but still retaining this principle and this ambition that we continue to be a vibrant air hub. We believe that this is important. I think just last week you heard about the plans for Terminal 5. These are starting again, and we do need to fill up this capacity, but on a more sustainable basis. In terms of how we approach this work, we have actually looked at it from 3 domains, the airport, the airline, as well as ATM. This is work that's ongoing. We just had an advisory panel, which I will share later, to advise some of these recommendations, and the detailed recommendations will actually be released sometime next month. And what we plan to do is then, with the recommendations, develop targets, and this will be embedded and fleshed out in our Sustainable Air Hub Blueprint, which will be released sometime next year. But in brief, And in truth, the many of options are known. I mean, aviation is an international sector. People have been exploring this topic many years. So the many of options are known. So for the airport, we are looking at maximizing solar deployment, including into more challenging areas such as the airfield, taxiways. If you look at from Google Earth, actually airports are big land take areas, but not all areas can be used for solar panels. So we're exploring certain areas that's maybe closer to the taxiway to see, of course, there are safety and technical considerations to see whether we can maximize the deployment of solar power. We're looking at electrifying the airside grid, the airside vehicular fleet. We're looking at circularity. There is actually a lot of waste produced with travel. So how much of this can be returned to the system, whether through reclamation into energy, conversion to energy. Systems optimization. Again, airports are mega systems. You have the air side, you have the land side. There are a lot of local inefficiencies. So the question is, can we build digital twins to explore how some of these inefficiencies could be removed through system optimization? Again, the concept and the technology is not so new, but it's really the challenge of pulling together different data sets, different data sources across the entire ecosystem where there are many stakeholders and many legacy systems. And finally, we also will look at tapping on renewable energy imports riding on the tender by EMA. So that's the airport sector. Airline is probably the most difficult. Again, it's the physics. How do you keep an aircraft in the air? You need a very energy-dense fuel. And so far, the big game changer will be sustainable aviation fuels as a drop-in option. Of course, they are not cheap. They are about 3 to 5 times more expensive than normal jet fuel. So we have to look at how do we help with that transition towards a different kind of fuel source. Longer term, we're also looking at hydrogen. Again, it's really like various options, and this is probably a multi-decade process to look at how we can tap hydrogen as a potential alternative fuel for powering aviation and also powering aircraft as well as other kind of aviation activities. Operational improvements. These are small little things that we can do, things like engine wash, other things that was mentioned. Really, again, from the MRO tech handling side, how can we reduce the use of, or how can we reduce even in small scale carbon emissions? Because for every movement where you reduce a certain carbon footprint, actually once you multiply that by the multiple hundreds and thousands of movements that we see at the airport every day, that actually adds up to quite a bit. Then fleet renewal. The easiest way to actually right now to gain fuel efficiency actually is to replace the older aircraft. So that's also a strategy that fortunately our national carrier has been exploring quite for many years. Then we go to the field that's perhaps less familiar, but Singapore in CS, we are also the air navigation service provider. So we are also looking at various initiatives on the air traffic management side to enhance the flight paths and to reduce carbon emissions. So things like advanced demand capacity balancing, performance-based navigation, gate-to-gate trajectory optimization. I won't go into detail, but if you want a further discussion on these concepts, you can do that later during the break. We also see 4 key enablers, so policy and regulation. What are the policy we set around, for example, the profile of energy use at the airport, the profile of fuel use at the airport, what are the regulations around the introduction of more combustion engine vehicles on the air side. So these are certain policies that we are reviewing. Industry development, so sessions like this to look at opportunities to collaborate with industry, to look at test bedding and trials, infrastructure, as well as workforce transformation, because we do need to change some of the skill sets that we may have in our workforce to help them transit to a different work environment. So as what was mentioned, I think the industry has actually moved ahead. So in Singapore, we're quite fortunate. Singapore Airlines, being a member of IATA, has already committed to net zero emissions by 2050. Changi, Airport Group, likewise, being a member of Airports Council International, have likewise committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and net or zero carbon growth or carbon neutral growth from 2018 to 2030. So they are holding it constant right now. Then for CAAS, the main ground handler, they are even more aggressive. They are looking at reducing their carbon footprint by 50% by 2030. A large part of it comes from the fact that they operate a lot of airside vehicles right now, which can be converted to alternative or cleaner energy sources. But there are challenges, we won't underestimate it. If you look at airport emissions or domestic emissions, actually a large part of it is electricity. So 85% is derived from electricity. So the quality of the electricity that we use at Changi will have a strong influence on the carbon emissions at the airport, which is why when we look at renewable energy imports, that's actually a very interesting proposal for us. Then if you look at other sources, diesel, that's really where all the aircraft, airside fleets are tapping on. So that's a 10, maybe 12% that we can potentially eliminate if we convert the vehicular fleet to electricity. But it will not be full 11% because even in Singapore, if you use electricity from the grid electricity is also not quite clean, which is why we also need to look at changing the profile of the grid energy as well. For international emissions, we are a member of the pilot scheme for CORSIA, so Singapore has come on board. Of course, with the pandemic, the baselines are perhaps a bit skewed, so there are discussions at ICAO to look at how do we reset and review the CORSIA scheme to make it a bit more consistent with the original objectives, which is to allow for some level of offsetting above a certain growth level. The challenge, of course, is we are in a region where perhaps ambitions around sustainability are not as strong. So around the figure, about 50% of RTKs in Asia Pac are covered by CORSIA. A large part is because China and India are not on board, and they have actually very strong reservations around certain elements of ICAO's aviation sustainability strategy. On SAF, just about a quarter of airlines in Asia Pacific have set SAF targets, and most of them we know are in Northeast Asia. So as a hub in Southeast Asia and as a hub that competes for transfer traffic within this part of the world, actually most of the competitor hubs that we consider or the peer hubs that we consider as alternatives to us are actually not as ambitious on the sustainability angle. So that's a competitive element that we do need to be quite cautious about. So these are further details of what we are doing. I think we will share these slides with the participants so you can take a look. So things like solar deployment, we have almost maximize the potential deployment of the rooftops. There's perhaps just a few more spaces that we can use. That's why we are moving beyond the roofs to the airfield, because that's where a lot of empty land is available. Airside electrification, we have set an ambition to potentially, maybe in the next decade or so, remove all the combustion engine vehicles, either by converting them to electric variants or looking at alternative sources like biodiesel or even hydrogen fuel cells to power these vehicles. Energy efficiency measures, and then, like I mentioned, the national grid is a very important element. T5, certainly the biggest project that we are undertaking. The new terminal that opens in the mid-2030s must be more sustainable. It must be a low-energy building. It must incorporate the latest technologies and capabilities in cooling, in optimization or energy. Of course, because we are planning it now, the challenge is we are looking at technologies of today to be developed and deployed in a 10 to 15-year time frame. So there are a lot of technology scans that we'll need to do to make sure when the building starts operation in 12, 15 years' time, we are able to at least build a state-of-the-art terminal at that point. Aviation fuels, airlines. So we have started trials with SIA to look at sustainable aviation fuel. So we have actually deployed the first set of SAF at Changi just a few weeks ago. So they are passing through the hydrant at Changi, and we have tested out operationally, it can be done. Now it's really on the commercial element. Of course, we are in a very fortunate place. In Singapore, we do have Neste that will start production sometime next year with about 1 million tons of SAF. 1 million tons might sound very small, and it is very small, but in perspective, actually, it makes Singapore the largest producer of SAF in the world. And that is really a good story that we like to tell because it says that there are also a lot of commercial opportunities. With SAF, actually, you are no longer tied to oil wells in the ground. You're no longer tied to certain geological or geographical advantages. You are looking at feedstock that is really available around you. So like in Singapore, in Neste, they are using used cooking oil. So every society cooks and eats, so every society will have used cooking oil that could potentially be used to produce SAF. Other alternatives that people are looking at, plastics, eventually they're looking at technology to convert plastics back to back to fluid and back to jet fuel. So these are all, this will change the dimension for aviation because it means that almost any country with the technology will have the feedstock and can potentially produce SAF. So the geography, the whole economics of the whole fuel production system could change. We're also looking at hydrogen. I also mentioned CAAS. So this is more details about the SAF pilot. So that has happened. Right now, on top of the operational trial, we are also overlaying something that's perhaps equally important, which is the financial and accounting element. Because SAF, again, a lot of innovation happening in SAF. The physical molecule actually could be sold at the price of a jet fuel. The attribute for carbon reduction actually is sold separately. It's a bit like a derivative. It's sold separately, and it can be sold directly to the end customers or for airlines. So there is a separation of the physical benefit of the fuel and the carbon emission mitigation benefit of the fuel. And it is this second part which is quite novel to the aviation sector, and we need to look at the right accounting frameworks to allow for this benefit of that carbon mitigation to be able to be accounted for and recognized. What this also means is that if you think about it, and that's probably also a challenge, is that this financial or mitigation benefit need not be tied to where your airline operates. And this is what's happening. A lot of airlines, when you see them making big announcements around SAF purchases, they're actually buying it out of very select regions in the world because there is this financial benefit that they can account. It need not be tied to where the actual fuel is being delivered. So again, that's an opportunity for us. Could we be a SAF hub for airlines to tap and derive and secure their credits? We don't know, but that's a strategy that we're also looking at. So hydrogen, so we have actually entered, I know this is a Boeing event, but I think we have also entered into an MOU with Airbus, the other major OEM. We're quite happy to explore collaborations with Boeing as well. I think some of my colleagues are here, they can talk to you. So we're looking at hydrogen. What are the potential use of hydrogen, both to power the airside fleet and also longer term around hydrogen aircraft, which also creates certain considerations around policy and also the infrastructure needed to support refueling of these hydrogen aircraft. So these are happening. We have also brought on board other partners such as CAG and Linde to look at a detailed study. And we hope, whenever the results are available, to share them with this group as well. So ATM, I'll skip over this part because it's generally quite technical. So enablers, so these are some of the things that we are considering. This is a long-term, decade-long plan. So we need to start to look at strategies to change some of the policy and regulations, even down to things like the type of, for example, the type of vehicles that can be registered at the airport for airside use. Industry development, we do need to create a new ecosystem, not just with the traditional OEMs, but with the new players coming on board There's also eVTOL companies, there are also new energy companies. Neste actually is not a traditional supplier to Changi Airport, but they are new and they will be a key player in the years to come. Then infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure changes. I think many of you, when you travel through Changi, you don't realize it, but Terminal 1 is actually almost 50 years old. Yeah. Well, not about 40 odd years old. It opened in 81, sorry, about 40 over years old. It doesn't feel like a 40-year-old building, but for those who are aware, at the end of the day, when you design when the building is 40 years old, there will be some constraints around the basic backbones in terms of space, the kind of energy, even the size of the loading of the substations that we can put in terms of charging infrastructure. So there are challenges that we need to look at in terms of retrofitting existing terminals as well. Then workforce transformation. How do we retrain and reskill the current workforce? And also, more importantly, how do we attract workers to come in? We know that sustainability is a topic that excites the young. The challenge, of course, is aviation is, in a sense, losing a bit of its romance. And on top of that, we are seen as a very pollutive sector. So how do we marry the both and reprofile aviation as a new and exciting sector that the young could join us still? So IAP, this was a process that we started at the air show. I'd like to share that both Boeing as well as Airbus are on board of the IAP. We had a lot of detailed discussions and a broader deep dives with a wider group of organizations. Like I mentioned, this report will likely be shared and announced sometime next month. And after that, we are quite happy to again share the details and hopefully create more opportunities for collaboration with us as well. So the timeline. So it's been a busy year. So everything you see is in 21. And it shows, I think, the urgency that not just in Singapore, but internationally. Of course, I think COVID did disrupt a lot of planning, but I think we are moving and we are moving fast. So if you look at the first SAF flight, those were in 2017, almost 5 years ago. Interesting initiative, but I think things really started to move earlier this year with the formation of the Sustainability Office. We started the SAF pilot. We have MOUs with New Zealand, with Airbus, with UK on sustainability issues. In terms of ICAO side, I think Eugene mentioned the long-term aspirational goal, or what we call LTAC. Actually, we had our first high-level meeting physically in Montreal, which is the headquarters of ICAO, just in July. And there has been strong momentum. So the states did agree to recommend to the Assembly that ICAO adopts a long-term goal of net zero by 2050. Of course, there will be a big basket of measures around technical support, capacity building, because not all states are in the same position. But we do hope that when the paper goes to Assembly for discussion in September, that report will be endorsed, and ICAO can then say with confidence that we join industry, that the states join industry to commit to a long-term goal of net zero 2050 for international aviation. So that's the presentation. We're quite happy to I'm happy to just stay around during tea break and take some questions after that.